to the Power of One. Today, I'm going to speak with Senator Sharif Street. We're going to speak about the gun violence that is happening in the city of Philadelphia, how it affects so many of us, and it has actually affected him and some of his staff members. Welcome to the show, Senator. Senator Street, there is so much gun violence in the city of Philadelphia. Tell me what you think can be done to decrease or even stop crime in our city of brotherly love.
Well, first, I think we have to recognize that crime and violence are complicated. We have to look, and I think we have to look at the social determinants of violence and crime. We have to treat this with the level of care we do everything else. So there are a few things. One, we really do need to look at strengthening our first responders, and the real first responders, even before police get involved, often are the community interveners, people who sometimes we call them crisis intervention specialists, sometimes we call them community interrupters, but they're neighborhood folk, like the folks from Put It Down, Daryl Schuler, Daoud Bay do this. There are a number of other folks. I don't single them out because they're friends, but we go out and talk to people, particularly young people, who are the people most likely to be involved in violence. And that's sort of our first responder piece. There is an additional thing. We need to look at some of the larger things. So we have whole communities that are basically suffering from PTSD. And there's an old saying that hurt people hurt people. And so we need to look at providing more counselors in schools and actually level of counseling services and the PTSD services to all of the folks who are engaged and who are impacted by violence. In suburban areas where you don't have this level of violence, we have one person can be killed at a school, and the entire school is shut down, and they have counselors talk to every student in the building, regardless of whether they knew that person or not. We live in communities where children will have in their communities people killed almost on a weekly basis, and we don't really do anything about the stress unless it is an immediate family member. But look, we've normalized things that are not normal, and that's part of why it continues. I think we need to also look at the ripple effect of addiction. Had a massive rise in opioid addiction, and it's not just that the people who are selling drugs or using drugs are killing people, but it increases what I like to call the misery index in community. You have a young person, dad might be incarcerated, mom becomes addicted, she's no longer able to provide services. All of a sudden now you have a 14-year-old or 15-year-old trying to fend for him or herself. Then you have people whose minds are altered because they're involved, that they're using mind-altering substances, and they're going out killing people. And so when we reduce addiction, we reduce the misery index. Then there are things that are more long-term, but are really important. Youth athletic programs. Some of the best way we can pull people off the streets is through youth athletic programs, addressing employment of not just youth as in people under 18, but 18 to 24-year-olds who are doing a lot of the violence. The fact that they lack constructive outlets for employment and other and educational opportunities, that needs to be addressed. So what I would say is, look, and I could go on for a while on this, but what I would say is we need to look at the underlying conditions. We know that violence is highly correlated with poverty. We know that people who have been subject to violence are more likely to be subject to it again. And there are a number of things that we should be doing. And yes, we do need to there is a role for law enforcement, and law enforcement needs to be interacting with the community. We need cops out of cars walking the beat so they can know what's going on, and so that there can be relationships established and people can trust them. We need to have probably more police officers we have now, but they don't need to be a military occupying force. They need to be integrated in the community with a level of cultural sensitivity and cultural competency, so they know the difference between a guy on his way to commit a crime and a guy coming home from work.
Which, very powerful answer. And you spoke about crimes happening in certain sections. So as you and I are both in the Northwest section of Philadelphia, and in the Northwest section of Philadelphia, we have the 5th, 14th, 35th, and 39th. You look at a crime in the 5th Police District, totally different than the crime in the 14th, 35th, and 39th. So those children that are going to school, like you said, they are not strangers to gun violence, which is sad, and they have to go to school every day. But when things happen in certain sections of the city, it seems like it's not tolerated. And even within the 14th, you have Chestnut Hill. So again, that's different from we're going down towards your office and going towards Broad Street. How can we get to that point in all neighborhoods of the city of Philadelphia to be like that 5th Police District, to where we're not dealing with crime like we are in the 14th, 35th, and 39th?
Well, it's sort of like I was saying, crime and violence are highly correlated with poverty. Policing, changing the methodologies of policing alone is not going to get us there. Sylvester Johnson, when my dad was married, used to say that we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. And what he was saying is, sure, police and law enforcement has a component, but there are other things. We have to look at what are we doing around the educational system for those other police districts, so 14th, 35th, and 39th. What are the levels of access to mental health care? What are the addiction services available? Do you know that a person who lives in the 5th, much more likely to have private health insurance? Person who lives in say parts of the 14th or 39th or 35th, who gets addicted, much more likely to end up on Medicaid services, because the fact of the matter, family healthcare is probably employer related, but tied to employer. You lose your job because you become addicted. You know that a person on Medicaid probably is going to be eligible for like 30 days of inpatient services. People in private healthcare, sometimes we are told that they can stay on an addiction in the healthcare in inpatient services for a year or 2 years. And so how can a person who's poorer, already has more issues, has more challenges to recover to, we're told you have to recover from addiction faster, and then we wonder why the cycle of relapse happens. And that just causes more pain and misery. I use that not to say that is the sole criteria, but to talk about how there are reinforcing things that happen in communities with violence that cause those communities to continue to have more violence. And then the stress of not having appropriate access to PTSD is more likely to cause more addiction, which is going to cause more violence, which is going to cause more PTSD. And so if we're going to reverse that, we have to look at what's going on with the schools, what's going on with the health, access to healthcare, and access to healthcare, both in terms of the quality of facilities, but also it doesn't matter if you don't have a way to pay for the healthcare that's delivered in those facilities. Access to payment of healthcare. What is the continuum of care? What are we going to look? And then we have the issues of ghost guns, right? Ghost guns. There's a proliferation of ghost guns that are happening primarily in lower income communities and communities of color, and we need to be looking at that. Cop can stop a guy, lock him up, take what he thinks is a gun off of him. It looks like a gun, it shoots like a gun, it kills like a gun, but because of this loophole around ghost guns and the way it came in 3 parts, you had to snap them together, and it's made out of super hard plastic, not metal. The crime lab says it's not a gun, and therefore you can't. It's difficult to get a prosecution on the possession. We need to do something about that. These are all. Whereas the likelihood that somebody is selling a bunch of ghost guns out of the trunk of a car up in the 5th is a lot less likely. And so there are things that are law enforcement, there are things that are social services, there are things that are educational, and there are things that are recreational that all are impacted, that all contribute to our gun violence. And what you will find is some communities tend to have more of all of them, like a community like Chestnut Hill, and other communities tend to have less of all of them. If you take Germantown and Chestnut Hill, which are not geographically far apart, it's night and day when you talk about all the things I just got done talking about.
So true. So true. Now tell me how elected officials can help with gun violence, and have you written any laws or enforced any laws that will help Philadelphians that are affected by gun violence?
Sure. I mean, one thing we've done. I was part of work with a group of all of our African American senators worked together and pushed the Democratic caucus and ultimately the governor and the Senate. We were able to get an additional $45 million statewide to be applied towards gun violence prevention programs, violence prevention programs. That's been helpful. We've also moved money to folks who are in individual programs that are community violence interrupters. We've moved money to enhance some of these educational opportunities and to address some of the disparities in healthcare. All that being said, it's not enough, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. So I don't wish anyone to say, well, you did all this, you moved $45 million. Well, that's the problem solved, because we probably needed to we probably need to add another $100 million in order for those programs to be adequately funded. We put $1 billion of additional money in education since I've been in the Senate, but we're still in the city of Philadelphia, that's $1 billion statewide, still probably $120 million underfunded, even after we increased funding by $120 million, because we started off $250 million underfunded. And so, and then COVID-19, hit our communities harder. And so the mitigations that shut down all these programs, these in-person contacts, we already knew we had a digital divide, but now the digital divide means we have less access to mental health, we have less access to education, and we have less access to job opportunities. And so, and more likely to get infected. And so we need to be addressing the digital divide in a way that is substantially different, because it now impacts the economics and therefore gun violence. And so we've done a lot, but we are nowhere near to close. Senator Hughes and I, along with others, are going to have a press conference later today to talk about some of the things we have done. But I fully recognize there is a lot more to do. Finally, I will conclude. I was part of creating, after my relative Gawa was killed, we were able to create. My colleagues reached out and asked me what they could do for me. You don't really do it for me or our family, but there's a lot we could do to stop this from happening to others. So we did create a crime prevention caucus with a goal of looking at the underlying social determinants of violence and figuring out how we can use some of the nearly $7 billion we have sitting around the state to fund some of those programs, so that other families don't have to go through and be impacted by violence in the way that happens on a daily basis in the city of Philadelphia.
Senator Street, recently, or not too long ago, your office was shot up along with the office at the NAACP. I did see you on the news with some other elected officials in the press conference being held, and you saying that you wanted to raise some more money. What came to my mind was, what about those victims whose houses have been riddled with bullets? What about that mother whose son was murdered and her house or the father's house may have been riddled with bullets? They are not eligible to file a claim through victims' compensation, because through victims' compensation, property damage is not an eligible category. So as you were speaking about poverty, they can't get their windows fixed. They can't get, say if there's holes in the walls, they can't get that stuff fixed. Relocation is not even an option for, say, that mother whose son was murdered on her porch or something, and she was in a house, because she was not the direct victim. So through victims' compensation, a victim can be reimbursed for up to $1,000. So yes, there is so much work that needs to be done. And then think about those victims who does not have a connection, like with you, and like your college and people reaching out to you to say, what can I do? There are so many family members who cannot bury their family members because they don't have life insurance. So I know I just gave you an earful. So we're looking at relocation for those victims who can only be reimbursed for up to $1,000 through victims compensation, and they don't have the money to be reimbursed. We're looking at those people whose houses were riddled with bullets. And I just took a call today for a gentleman. This man is beside himself. He's scared to come out of his house. He was getting ready to get in the shower and someone just started shooting. But I said to him, I am so sorry, sir. I can't file a claim for you through victims compensation. Property damage is not an eligible expense. Senator Street, what can we do for these Philadelphians who are feeling the effects of gun violence every single day? And like you said, they don't have the means to be able to fix their house. They don't have the means to be able to move. How can we help them?
There are a few things. One, on terms of relocation, Senator Anthony Hardy Williams, Tony Williams and I were talking earlier this week, and we are looking at some legislative solutions around expanding relocation, the access to relocation dollars. And so there's some specific things we're looking at because this issue was raised, and we're looking at a legislative solution to that. We can certainly expand the eligibility access for those dollars, but one of the challenges with expanding eligibility access without expanding the pot of money is it's already not a very large pot. And so we need to expand the pot of money as we look at the eligibility criteria. And so we're looking at that. Unfortunately, the legislative process is slow. And I'd like to make it move faster, but with 253 members of the General Assembly, 50 members of the Senate, 203 in the House, and then the governor's office that has to sign off on it, it's not a quick process. So I don't want to create any illusions that it is, but that only that we are aware of the issue, we've begun the legislative process to try and address it. Second issue with respect to what can we do around people who just don't have access to resources. When I started talking about social determinants of violence, that's certainly one of them. We should look at making property repairs eligible. There are ways we can look to do that as well. I think I also chair the Banking and Insurance Committee. We can look at looking at the insurance provisions so that homeowners insurance covers that. Some policies may and some policies may not, but we certainly need to look at that. And we probably need to have a larger, some sort of fund like we do for floods when people live in floodplains can't get flooded. The government pays the flood insurance. We should probably be paying for the property damage associated with gun violence as well. And those are real things we should look at. I would say, I just want to say this. When I was a kid, there was a supermarket that one of the big national chains came into Philadelphia. As most of you all know, my dad was a councilman most of my childhood. And we would go in the supermarket and my dad noticed they were searching all the Black and brown folk and not searching other folk. So he wouldn't let them search his bag. And they came there because he said it was a racially discriminatory policy. And they wouldn't let him search his bag. And so eventually they put a little picture of him by the booth because they realized he's a councilman. I said, don't search this guy. And so he sent me in there with his bag. And he said, don't let him search you. The security's going to come, the police are going to come in and try to arrest you. He said, and I said, okay. And I did as I was told. And afterwards, some security came and they got me, and he came running in to leave him alone. But there was some chance I could have. I said, Dad, why did you want that to happen to me? And he said, because when it happened to me, I drew attention to it. And it happens, and they just figured out a way to not do it to me. And it continues to happen to people in our community every day. And he said, sometimes things have to happen to people like us who have the ability to raise the level of awareness about issues that are happening to our people every day so that we can make sure that they don't happen to everyone else. And so obviously I did not want my office to be shot up. I did not want a relative to be murdered. I did not want, it's not just me personally, my district director, Henry, lost a grandchild. I had a staff person, a staff person lose a spouse a few years ago. I had a staff person lose a daughter. At least half of my staff has lost a relative to gun violence. And not only it was very well publicized when the bullets went into the one office, but in front of my political office I'm sitting at right now, my staff person is sitting next to me off camera, and I were standing outside, and a man was killed down the block. And that's in my other office, another part of the city. And in my other office, they were shooting gunfire outside. Thank God nobody died, but they were shooting automatic weapons, and the staff were basically hiding to make sure the bullets didn't fly in the window. So when the stuff happens to me in our office, we're able to raise the level of awareness. We have a crime prevention caucus that is structured, that is designed on addressing issues for everyone, because people were paying attention to what happened to my family. And the other senators and representatives, particularly some of the Republicans and people live in other rural areas, may not pay attention to this, paid attention because they have to work with me. And then finally, I would say that they are and then we got more attention to it when my office got shot up again, and thank God that happened at night. No one was hurt from our staff, but a man was shot who lived. There was a circle of blood around the office as he was running away from his assailants. That has caused, and even the president pro tem in his speech opening the day of Senate talked about gun violence because of what happened in my office. And so what I have said to my colleagues is, we appreciate thoughts and prayers, but if you really want to change our community, we can legislative action and funding for programs is the concrete and tangible way that we can address this. And one of my grandfather's favorite verses of the Bible came from the book of James in the second chapter. And it was a group of good church folk were walking their way to church, and in the passage, and they see some people who are having worldly troubles, and they ask them to accept God, and the people don't want to accept their help. And when they go and they talk to the religious leader, he said, we saw these people, they were in a condition of they needed help. And we asked them to accept God, and they didn't want to accept God. He said, what did you do to change their condition? And they said, well, we didn't do anything. We just asked them to have God. God would help them. He said, if you want them to accept God from you, they have to see God working through you. And without that, your faith without works is dead. And so what I say to my colleagues is, let not our faith be dead. We appreciate all of my colleagues for whatever backgrounds of faith who are in the General Assembly. But if people want to believe in our faith, then we need to show some works, because we're in a position to do something about it.
And that's true, Senator. I thank you so much for saying that, because I hear that often, where the victims feel like they don't care about me. Think about those mothers who have lost a child, and they say to me, they don't care. Miss Nelson, they just don't care. And that hurts. That hurts me, because I am an advocate. I am an advocate for victims, and I will try to move a mountain for anyone that contacts me for my help. And I don't want that to be a message for victims or co-homicide survivors, that they just don't care. So I thank you for joining me today, Senator, and I thank you for answering that hard question about those families who can't get help because they don't have the resources or connections that some of us do. So I thank you for answering that question. And Senator, I thank you for joining me today. And know I am in this fight with you. You call me anytime, and I am going to be that voice for the victims. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Senator Street answered some very hard questions, and I think I gave him some things to think about, because this fight is just beginning in the city of Philadelphia, and how we can help those affected by crime, victims and co-homicide survivors, as well as community members. I am fighting for you. My job is to be an advocate for those who have been affected by crime. Peace and blessings.